Unfortunately, there are villains who cannot be stopped, nothing is sacred to them, and everyone is at risk of becoming the next victim of a robbery, rape, or a true bloodbath driven only by animalistic aggression. On the evening of January 15, 1984, the Bennett family in Aurora, Colorado, USA, celebrated the birthday of Melissa, the eldest daughter, who was 7 years old. Her parents were Bruce and Deborah. Late in the evening, Bruce offered the mother and her husband to stay overnight, but the woman decided to drive home, and this decision probably saved their lives. When she left the house around midnight, Constance noticed that the garage door was unlocked but didn't pay it much attention. Bruce and Deborah worked together with her mother, Constance, in the family business, a furniture store. The young people were very punctual and never late for work, but on January 16, they did not show up at the store on time. Constance was worried because this was entirely uncharacteristic of her son and his wife. Even if the couple had problems, they always warned her if they were prevented from coming or would be late, and they never did so without a good reason, so their complete absence was suspicious. Constance suspected they had continued celebrating their daughter's birthday after her departure and had drunk too much, although this was also uncharacteristic for them. She tried to call the couple, but no one at the house answered, which was also troubling. Not wanting to torment herself with doubts, Constance decided to drive to the family's house to make sure they were okay. She arrived there around 10 a.m. and parked the car in the driveway. The garage door was fully open, which immediately alarmed her. It was more open than the previous evening when she had left the house. The silence was also unsettling. The normally loud, cheerful, and active family was now quiet. She decided to walk through the garage since it was wide open. Inside, it was empty, but she immediately noticed that the front door to the house was ajar, which increased her unease, for Deborah and her husband never left the house open to outsiders. Constance decided to go inside and approached the door cautiously. She opened it just a step and immediately saw a pool of blood that dripped down the stairs. It was almost dry by that point. In the last corner of the staircase, she saw her son. He was covered in blood and showed no signs of life. His mother called his name, but he did not respond. Constance then called Deborah and the girls by name but heard no answer. She hesitated to go up the stairs and immediately called the police. The police officers arrived at 10:28 a.m. and immediately began searching the house in the hope of finding someone alive. The police officers initially focused their attention on Bruce. The deceased was found wearing only underwear, apparently sleeping when he heard a strange noise and went to the stairs to see what was happening. He received numerous blows to the head, and his body also had stab wounds that might have come from a knife. Additionally, numerous defensive wounds on the arms were observed, resulting from an uneven fight with the murderer. On the floor in a pool of blood, the police found a lock of hair that likely belonged to the victim himself. The head of the family was not immediately dead. Bruce was bloodied, and bloody footprints led up the stairs. It is evident that he lost consciousness halfway up and later simply slid down and died on the stairs. On the walls and on the floor, there were blood splatters from blows with a heavy object, as well as from slit veins from which blood flowed. There were additional tracks that clearly did not belong to the first victim of the perpetrator. In all the rooms where the sleeping members of the Bennett family had been, bloody handprints led up the stairs. The investigators cautiously went up the stairs, checking whether the intruder might still be in the house. He could have been injured in the attack and pose a danger. Next, they found Deborah. She lay face up at the foot of the bed on the floor in a pool of her own blood. The young mother was also wearing only underwear, probably caught by the murderer in her sleep. She apparently tried to cover herself in panic as the bedding was crumpled, but this did not protect her from the numerous stab and beat injuries, similar to those of her husband. On the nightstand were her handbag and her clothes, and a shelf had been pulled out. At first glance, it seemed as if the perpetrator had taken nothing, Perhaps he was looking for something specific, or he had decided to stage a robbery in a not very convincing way. The police then entered the children's room and found Melissa, who was also lying next to the bed on the floor. The child had been killed in the same way as her parents. The girl had struggled desperately, so she had stab wounds on her hands. She was dead and wearing her pajamas. Next to Melissa's bed, the shelf of her nightstand had also been pulled out. In the back corner of the room was a widely bloodied corpse, Vanessa, the youngest daughter. The bed where the girl had been was splattered with blood, and the child had also suffered several severe wounds. The 3-year-old Vanessa was still fighting for her life but was in a serious condition. Emergency services were immediately called to the scene and took the girl to a local hospital, where she received first aid and underwent major surgery as her jaw had been shattered by the impact of a hammer-like instrument. Her arms and legs were also shredded, and she lost a lot of blood from her head injuries. The youngest daughter of the family survived several operations and lengthy therapeutic procedures, and the doctors managed to restore mobility to her limbs, but the child still had a long way to go in her recovery. The police officers at the scene meticulously collected all possible evidence that could contain traces of the madman who had orchestrated this bloody massacre. Special attention was paid to the girl's room, where a suspicious blood trail suggested the murderer had lingered there for some reason, almost on the eve of Melissa's tragic birthday. Also, on the blanket crumpled on the bed was a white spot that resembled a stain from male fluids. After the investigators had carefully examined the scene of the tragedy, they constructed the picture of the terrible attack. When Bruce was awakened in the night by a strange noise, the young father went downstairs to see what was happening. As he went down the stairs, he heard a rustling from the direction of the garage and the kitchen. Bruce called his children's names, thinking one of the girls had woken up and wanted something to eat. However, at the foot of the stairs, the silhouette of a stranger appeared. Bruce realized it was a stranger and tried to warn the rest of the family of the danger, but at that moment, the unknown assailant attacked him and struck him on the head. In the darkness, the young father could not see who it was or what he was being hit with. In the next second, a dark shadow approached the confused young man and slit his throat. His family did not wake up from the noise. Bruce Bennett was left bleeding on the stairs. Meanwhile, the villain made his way upstairs and headed straight for the bedroom of the dying man's wife, Deborah. She was the next target and the only adult in the house who could still resist. Unfortunately, the young mother also noticed the danger too late. The intruder attacked and began beating her. After several blows to the head, Deborah lost consciousness, after which the perpetrator inflicted several deadly stabs. Apart from the 2 murdered adults, only small children were left, but the perpetrator did not stop there. He entered the girl's room and first attacked Melissa. He also beat the child until she no longer resisted and then stabbed her, as with the previous victims. Vanessa suffered the same fate. The murderer beat her and ended with several stab wounds. After the carnage, he simply walked away, leaving 4 bodies behind, from which, miraculously, 1 girl survived. The police found suspicious footprints in and around the garage where Deborah's handbag, its contents thrown onto the ground, was located. Initially, it was hard to say whether anything was missing without knowing the entire contents, but the murderer had clearly rummaged through it. A few meters from the garage, a large butcher knife was found, apparently from the family's kitchen cutlery, likely drawn by the noise of the intruder and attempted to stop him, but eventually became the first victim. At this time, the investigators already knew that the massacre had been committed with multiple weapons simultaneously, and it could not be ruled out that there were 2 perpetrators, each using a different weapon. A knife was found on the street, and during the investigation, it was discovered to have been used for the wounds. The second weapon was a bludgeoning tool resembling a hammer or something similar. The investigators later suspected that it was a tool since they found traces of it on the wall. It was clear that the perpetrator had randomly struck furniture and objects, causing a lot of destruction, glass shards, and other damages. An important piece of evidence was the perpetrator's shoe prints. He wore work boots that resembled construction boots, and their prints were found in all rooms he passed through. After analyzing the number and type of prints, the investigators concluded that they had been left by a single person, which meant that there was a criminal without accomplices who used two weapons at once to massacre defenseless people. Constance surveyed the house carefully, but in her opinion, nothing had been stolen. The only thing that could have been missing was the money from Deborah's wallet. Of course, the mother-in-law did not know how much money was in it, and there were no living witnesses who could confirm this suspicion. The medical examiners determined that all the deceased and the surviving girl had suffered head injuries from the hammer, which were the cause of death for Deborah and Melissa. Bruce, however, did not die from this. He also received several severe blows to the head, but his cause of death was his slit throat. The murderer left him bleeding on the stairs. Bruce probably even heard his wife and children dying but could do nothing more. Swabs were taken from the bodies of the woman and the children to perform DNA tests. In those years, however, this test was still far from the accuracy of modern techniques, so the only thing the medical examiners could determine from the tests was the blood type of the person who had left the sperm at the scene of the massacre. It turned out that the mother and the two girls had been raped, and of course, all DNA samples were secured to convict the perpetrator. However, the police still had no clues and not a single suspect in the initial phase of the investigation. Despite the available traces, the collected fingerprints, and the DNA samples, with the existing databases, no matches could be found. Naturally, this was still in the early stages at that point and did not further the investigation. It seemed as if the incident would become an unsolved case that would gather dust on the shelves of the archives. Fortunately, this was not the case. The murderer struck again, and this was the turning point in the investigation. Within just 2 weeks, there were a series of attacks where a hammer was used. The attack on the Bennett family was just one episode in a bloody series by the maniac the media called the Hammer Murderer. It turned out that there had been 3 similar attacks in the area before. The very first attack occurred on January 4, 1984. On that day, the monster's wrath hit the newly married couple Kim and Jim Hodoff, who also lived in Aurora, Colorado. The attacker broke into their house in the middle of the night and attacked the couple when they least expected it. Jim was awakened by a hammer blow to the face, then the attacker threw the same weapon at Kim, causing her a concussion. While the injured Jim chased the attacker, he called emergency services, but the police officers could not find the attacker that night. Both survived but were seriously injured in the attack. Unfortunately, no one saw the face of the murderer at the time of the attack. The woman's purse was removed from the house. The second attack occurred 5 days later, on January 9, 1984. A 20-year-old from Aurora named Donna Dixon returned home late in the evening. She lived alone at home at the time because her fiancé Ronald was a pilot and had taken a flight overnight. He only returned the next morning and immediately noticed that the garage of Donna's house was open. Donna's handbag lay before him on the ground, its contents scattered across the driveway, along with the mail. Another victim of the maniac. The young man immediately noticed that near the driver's door of the car lay the girl's clothes, and blood traces led into the house, up to the bedroom where the victim of the attack lay. Donna Dixon suffered severe head injuries. The pervert had also attacked her with a hammer, attempted to kill her, and raped her. Fortunately, the girl was still alive when her fiancé discovered her and was taken to a nearby medical center, where doctors diagnosed severe brain damage. Ronald slept with a weapon in the hospital outside her room to protect his beloved until Donna was assigned police protection. Donna underwent multiple surgeries and gradually regained basic movement and speech functions. Initially, she had the intelligence of a 2-year-old and relearned how to eat and speak, but Ronald did not abandon her, he supported and helped her repeatedly. Later they married, and after a while, Donna was able to lead a fulfilled life, but the physical and mental effects of the attack remained for life. The memories of the bloody attack never revived, so she was not able to contribute to the capture of the maniac who terrorized the city. Another victim of the maniac was Patricia, a resident of the city of Lakewood in the state of Colorado. The maniac also inflicted numerous blows to her head with a hammer, such that she had no chance of survival. The 50-year-old woman had moved to the area just before the attack, while her daughter had 2 children, worked, and was a single mother. Thus, the grandmother was raising the children. Another victim of the maniac moved to this woman to help her take care of her grandchildren. Patricia was found in her apartment, beaten to death with a hammer. The murderer had previously entered through the widely open garage door, delivered numerous blows to her head such that she had no chance of survival, and raped the woman. According to the medical examiners, she was attacked between 1300 hours and 1500 hours in the afternoon when Patricia came home from work during her lunch break. The signature of the murderer matched completely, except for the single circumstance that this time he struck in the afternoon. Yet, here too, a large number of DNA samples of the attacker were found, although the attack occurred in broad daylight, which was quite untypical for a maniac. The other aspects of the crime were identical to the preceding series of bloody crimes. Unfortunately, this still gave the police no serious leads. An obvious attacker must have lived near the locations where he found his victims. Then came the attack on the Bennett family, in which 3 people were killed at once. The investigators were again frustrated, they were powerless, and the investigation stagnated. In the meantime, the dissatisfaction among the population grew by the hour. The residents realized that the criminal from the area was terrorizing the neighborhood and obviously would not stop. This meant that everyone was in danger, and no one could sleep peacefully anymore. On January 24th, FBI agents got involved in the investigations, reviewing all files, creating a psychological profile of the murderer, and needing to solve the crimes as quickly as possible. It became clear to them that all massacres had been committed by the same person. According to the profile, the perpetrator was a young man with an extensive criminal past. Since he was so successful in his break-ins, he must have had a past as a burglar. According to the FBI agents, the attacker was in his early 20s and was likely trying to fund himself and his bad habits through murder and theft. During the careful examination of the records, another important detail emerged: all the crimes were committed near a local construction site, and the shoe prints resembled the boots of construction workers, suggesting that the maniac worked as a construction worker and was regularly employed at various companies. The team that was supposed to investigate these attacks in detail, however, would never start their work because the case took an unexpected turn. Early in the morning of January 27th, Roy Williams woke up in the small town of Kingman, Arizona, in his bed, suffering severe pain in his head. He saw a stranger attempting to smash his head with hammer blows. As he woke up, the next victim kept his composure. Roy even spoke to his attacker, which distracted the murderer. Roy asked the attacker why he was doing this, but he didn't answer and suddenly fled the house without completing his bloody intent. Unlike all other cases, the victim miraculously escaped with only minor injuries that did not prevent him from remembering his attacker or identifying him. After getting a good look at the villain and remembering him perfectly, the man called the emergency services and the police. He was taken to the hospital with broken ribs and a head injury, needing over 100 stitches to repair his head and mutilated face, but Roy was the luckiest of all the attacker's victims. Police officers responded as quickly as possible to the case. A patrol was immediately after the attack in pursuit of the attacker. A few hours after the assault, one of the law enforcement officers was lucky not to be far from the house where another attack had been committed. He noticed a young man who looked disheveled and very nervous. He fidgeted around trying to catch a car and hitchhike away. The officer approached him, but he immediately ran off and hid in the bushes but was eventually caught and arrested. In the apartment of the last victim of the murderer, shoe prints were found that matched numerous prints from other victims' apartments. Initially, the shoes of the arrested individual were checked. They matched 100%. A large amount of blood traces was found on the sole. He was also identified by Roy Williams. The name of the detainee was Alex Ewing. He was a former carpenter and handyman who had worked on this construction site. In his short lifespan, he had managed to build an extensive criminal past. The profile created for the unknown perpetrator had determined his age at the time of the arrest as accurately as possible. The man was 20 years old. The profile was also not wrong about his profession and his experience with burglaries. Alex Ewing was immediately charged with attempted murder of Roy Williams and first-degree robbery, and evidence began to be collected to charge him for other assaults. He was taken to the Maha County Jail, where he would wait for a hearing in his case. Since the facility was overcrowded, he was moved a few months later to the State Penitentiary of Utah, where he was to remain until his trial scheduled for August 9, 1984. It was then decided to transfer him along with several other prisoners to Arizona. The maniac was moved in a specially equipped transporter. During the 5-hour drive, the convoy reached Henderson, Nevada. The vehicle was forced to stop for refueling. In the meantime, the prisoners were released to use the restroom while they paid for the gasoline. The guards were distracted, and just at that moment, while Alex Ewing was in the restroom, the criminal seized the opportunity and escaped. His disappearance was quickly noticed, and a search operation was initiated. The escorts requested additional support from the Henderson Police Department, and a large-scale search for the fugitive began. Around 10 p.m., 2 reports came in from the town that a suspicious man was lurking in the homes of a residential area. His description was similar to that of Alex Ewing. Apparently, he wanted to strike again. The murderer was considered particularly dangerous. He really had nothing to lose, and so all police officers rushed to the area to search for the fugitive. An hour and a half after the first report, the 20-year-old Barry called the police. She and her family had been attacked by an unknown assailant. The woman was awakened in the middle of the night by the crying of her youngest child and went to the kitchen to prepare a bottle of milk. At that moment, Alex attacked her, and she tried to run away from him. Her husband heard her screams and rushed to her aid, receiving several blows with the edge of an axe. The perpetrator then fled. No one was killed, but the husband suffered a broken arm. The children remained unharmed. However, the husband sustained a severe head injury but survived. The woman was able to escape only because she managed the critical situation and pretended to be dead. During the search of the house of the next victim, the police found that the handwriting matched completely with the habits of the fugitive. The axe used as the murder weapon was found on the kitchen floor. Unfortunately, Alex himself could not be caught. He managed to escape the police again. In the following days, every patrol in the city tried in vain to track him down and catch him. He seemed to have disappeared and gone into hiding again. Finally, on the 4th day, a young woman came to the station and reported suspicious calls from the area around Lake Mead. It turned out that the caller was an unknown young man who claimed he was hiding from the police and needed help. He tried unsuccessfully to arouse the woman's sympathy, but fortunately, she was not confused, turned off the madness of the crazy, and turned to the state police. The patrol officers immediately went to the aforementioned address and indeed discovered Ewing hiding in one of the local abandoned houses. When he realized he had been discovered, he opened fire on the police officers with a weapon stolen from the apartment of the last victim. Fortunately, the criminal was not hit. He was arrested, and with that, the series of bloody crimes was ended. The suspect was charged with attacking Roy, escaping from custody, 2 burglaries, and attempted murder of Nancy and her husband. Investigations were still ongoing in the previous cases, and evidence for a charge was being collected. The prosecution made all files and arguments known, and the jurors entered into deliberation to render a verdict. After several hours of deliberation, he was found guilty and sentenced to 110 years in prison. In 1989, the Aurora Police Department was still working on the case of the Bennett family, in which 3 people had been killed. The investigators collected and analyzed DNA traces found at the scene of the massacre. Unfortunately, the quality of the materials and the technology of the time did not allow for comprehensive information and no 100% proof of the belonging of the traces of male sperm found on Melissa's blanket. We only had to wait until 2001 when new technologies enabled a complete DNA profile to be created. At this point, however, it was necessary to match everything with the perpetrator himself, who was under jurisdiction in another state in Nevada. This led to difficulties, and it was not until 2016 that the DNA profile could be matched to the suspect when the law was repealed. It took another 2 years for the genetic material of the perpetrator to be included in the database. By this time, the CODIS database was already active, so the involvement of the perpetrator in the murder of Patricia could be confirmed. The media was interested in the case for almost half a century and finally managed to move the investigations away from a dead point. It turned out that the DNA found at the scene of the massacre of the Bennett family matched Alex completely. Ewing himself denied his involvement in the attacks, but it was evident that the death of an entire family was the work of his hands. The maniac was charged with triple first-degree murder and attempted murder and had to be extradited from Nevada to Colorado, where his criminal activities began. Every step of the way, the criminal tried to obstruct the prosecution with the help of his lawyer. A psychiatric report found him sane. The trial in the case of the Bennett family then took place in July 2021. Vanessa, who miraculously survived the Ewing attack in 1984, took the floor during the trial. She told the jurors about the problems she had in her life because of the actions of this monster. Her story moved many to tears. Alex Ewing was found guilty on August 6, 2021, on all charges. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences with parole after 80 years. The case of Patricia Smith proved to be even more complex. This trial also took place in 2021. The devil's lawyer continued to defend him at all costs, uncovering errors and inconsistencies in the investigations. Therefore, the trial was declared invalid. The defendant claimed he had committed no bodily harm and had been framed. A new trial in 2022 for Patricia Smith led to a conviction for first-degree murder and rape. Alex also received a life sentence for this crime. To this day, he is incarcerated at the Colorado Territorial Correctional Institution in Newton City. The other cases in which Alex Ewing was a suspect remain unresolved due to a lack of evidence or because of the statute of limitations. The investigators are sure that he is the one who committed them since Alex was active in this area at the time and they were committed with a similar modus operandi. Perhaps one day he will also be charged for these crimes, but one thing is comforting: Alex Ewing will never walk free again. Although Vanessa miraculously survived the attack, she not only lost her family but also herself. All her life, she suffered from the effects of a lifelong psychological and physical trauma, including PTSD, ADHD, and bipolar disorder. She suffered from partial paralysis of the left side of her body, memory problems, and for a time struggled with dependence on illegal substances and thoughts of suicide. Fortunately, she managed to cope with these. Today, she is 42 years old and lives with her second husband in Arizona. The victim of a maniac dreams of writing a book to help people who are struggling with similar problems. After the murderer of her family was caught and punished, she could finally experience peace and relief, according to her statements.
The events described in this video took place in a neighborhood called New Floyd in York County, Pennsylvania, USA. The Wittman family lived there, consisting of the head of the family, Ronald, his wife Sue, and their sons, 15-year-old Zachary and 13-year-old Gregory. They were a typical family belonging to the so-called middle class. Ronald and Sue worked in banking, and the boys attended high school. It was known that Zachary was much more diligent and had a high-grade point average, while Gregory was more successful in sports. To their parents, they always seemed to get along well. However, in the autumn of 1998, their lives took a completely unexpected turn. On Friday, October 2nd at 3:17 p.m., the emergency services received a call from Zachary. He was very frightened and stated that his brother was dying. The operator inquired what exactly was wrong, and the boy said he had been in his room when he heard a noise from the lower floor of the apartment. He immediately went downstairs and found his younger brother lying on the floor in a pool of his own blood. When the paramedics arrived at the scene around 3:25 p.m., Gregory was pronounced dead, which was not surprising given the severity of the injuries on his body. Zachary remained at the scene. There was a large amount of blood on his clothes and hands, and when asked how his brother's blood got on his clothes, he said he had received instructions from the emergency call center to administer first aid to his brother, and while following these instructions, he had soiled his clothes. The authorities initially did not bother Zachary or ask him unnecessary questions, as he was in a state of extreme shock. He was simply loaded into one of the ambulances and taken to the hospital. The teenager's parents were only informed of the incident several hours after Zachary had made the emergency call. At that time, Ronald was on a plane returning from a business trip. When his plane landed, he immediately went to the hospital where Zachary had been admitted. By then, the teenager had already been medically examined, and it was clear that his life was not in danger. Meanwhile, police officers waited for the doctor's permission to speak with the boy. Obviously, they wanted to find out what had happened as quickly as possible. As the sole witness, Zachary said that he wasn't feeling well and had therefore missed school. He said he had intentionally left the front door open and then gone to his room. This was so that Gregory, who was returning from school, wouldn't have to knock on the door and disturb him. After a while, he heard a noise coming from the ground floor. Zachary said it sounded as if a heavy object had been thrown against the wall. Startled, he immediately went downstairs to the ground floor where he allegedly discovered his brother. While investigators spoke with Zachary, crime scene investigators examined the house, and several other police officers questioned the neighbors. This brought the first important information to light. A young girl named Erin Jeffrey, whom many thought was Gregory's girlfriend, stated that she had called the Wittmans' house twice that day. Her first call was at 3:09 p.m. According to her, someone picked up the receiver and immediately hung up. A few minutes later, she tried again, and this time Zachary answered. He said that his younger brother had not yet come home. It turned out that this happened shortly before the boys called to the emergency services. After analyzing the information, the authorities found that Zachary's statement contradicted Erin's words. Several other witnesses who were questioned later stated that Gregory should have been home after 3:00 p.m. Judging by the time he boarded the bus that left the school building and dropped him off at the nearest bus stop, Gregory should have been home by 3:06 p.m. at the latest, meaning just before Erin's first phone call. But even if he wasn't home at that time, he must have been home when she called him the second time. So the authorities could not understand why Zachary denied that his brother was already home. Crime scene investigators focused on Gregory's bloody footprints, which extended from the front door to one of the bathrooms where Zachary had found his lifeless body. They conducted some tests with luminol and found that there were several less distinct footprints at the crime scene that someone had tried to wipe away. They all led to the back of the house. Furthermore, a barely visible blood trail was found in the garden. This trail led the police to one of the trees growing in the yard. The soil under this tree looked fresh. After the police dug a small hole, they found several items that could be directly related to the case. The first item was a knife that had apparently been used as the murder weapon. The second item was a pair of gloves. The subsequent forensic analysis confirmed the authorities' suspicions regarding the knife. Reports indicated that Gregory had been stabbed approximately 80 times, most of them in his neck and chest. In addition, numerous small defensive wounds were found. According to experts, Gregory died quite quickly, but he fought back with all his might against his attacker. Perhaps most surprising was the fact that after searching the house, the authorities found no evidence whatsoever of a possible intruder. Consequently, Zachary was arrested just 1 week after Gregory's murder, and although absolute evidence pointed to him as the assailant, he steadfastly denied it. Perhaps the parents of the brothers believed Zachary's story and supported him during the entire investigation. According to a preliminary court order, Zachary was to be placed under house arrest, allowing him to leave the house only to visit his doctor or speak with his lawyer. It is important to know that, according to Pennsylvania criminal law, murder was one of the charges that allowed the teenager to be sentenced as an adult. Nevertheless, the Wittman family's lawyer requested that the case be referred to a juvenile court, where Zachary, if found guilty, could only be incarcerated until the age of 21. However, a York County judge rejected the motion and ruled that Zachary would be tried as an adult. This decision, as well as other bureaucratic problems related to the admission of evidence, led to a delay in the trial by 4.5 years. Overall, the admission of evidence was an incredibly arduous process, at least for the prosecution. For example, when they appeared before the district judge in May 1999, they lost a total of over 30 pieces of evidence. This was because the Wittman's lawyer stated that some of the evidence found in the house had been discovered before the actual search warrant was issued. Nevertheless, much of the evidence was admitted, including, for example, gloves and a knife found in the garden of the house. The judge also ruled that Zachary's statement to the police officer who responded to the call was admissible, even though he was not yet under investigation and had not yet been read his rights. His parents, however, were confident that the lawyer would do his job and that the teenager would never receive a conviction. Ronald and Sue could not imagine that their eldest son could have killed his own brother. Indeed, such a thought seems truly incredible. The main trial did not begin until May 2003. By this time, Zachary was already 20 years old. According to later statements from his parents, his first lawyer became seriously ill during this period, and the one who represented him did not do his job as effectively as they would have wished. In particular, he did not make an effort to find independent experts who could have scientifically refuted much of the prosecution's evidence. And although Zachary continued to insist on his innocence, even his father Ronald tried to convince him to take responsibility for what had happened in order to receive a less harsh sentence. But Zachary remained stubborn. He repeatedly stated that he had never done anything to his brother and that such a thought had never crossed his mind. It is important to note that due to public interest in the case, the jury had to be selected not in York, but in Montgomery County. This measure guaranteed their complete impartiality during the trial. Zachary's parents repeatedly asked to speak during the trial to inform the jury that the brothers got along well. They also insisted that some family photos and videos be shown in the courtroom to demonstrate how friendly Zachary and Gregory were. However, the court rejected most of these requests. This was primarily because, for the majority of those involved in the trial, everything seemed clear-cut. And already on May 21, 2003, the jury found Zachary Wittman guilty of his brother's murder, and the only possible sentence at that time was life imprisonment without parole. After the verdict was announced, Zachary was allowed to say a few last words, which were as follows. "I want to say that I have always loved my brother. I will always love him. I miss him very much. I never did anything to hurt him. I hope and believe that people will understand that one day. That is all." With that, the trial concluded. However, Zachary's parents continued to fight. In 2007, they almost achieved a retrial. The basis for this was the ineffective work of the young man's previous lawyer. Zachary's parents reviewed all the evidence and concluded that at least one piece of evidence had not been examined. This piece of evidence was Gregory's fingernails. In the past, the pathologist who conducted the forensic examination of Gregory's body had stated that before his death, he clung to life with all his might and tried to resist. As a result, most of his fingernails on his hands were damaged. The nails were eventually clipped and sent to a laboratory for DNA analysis. However, the test results were never requested by either the prosecution or the defense. For the prosecution, the test was simply inconclusive, as 2 laboratories conducted over 20 tests simultaneously and examined other items found at the scene, and all results were either inconclusive or not probative. Nevertheless, Zachary's parents hoped that the DNA of an unknown person might have been under Gregory's fingernails to clear their eldest son of suspicion. However, the prosecution did everything to prevent the retrial. To achieve this goal, they appealed and ultimately obtained the desired result. In other words, the retrial was cancelled. For many, it was obvious that Zachary had killed his brother, but for his parents, that was not the case at all. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that no one who committed a crime as a juvenile could be sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Basically, this ruling was a kind of glimmer of hope for Zachary and his relatives. However, at that time, the law was not retroactive and only applied to new criminal cases. And it was only in 2016 that a new retroactive law was passed. Consequently, Zachary was placed on a list of already convicted offenders who were given the opportunity to appeal their sentences. All this time, the Wittmans had been hoping for a new and better investigation. They did what they could to free the then 30-year-old Zachary. Perhaps that's how a man who was something of an expert on wrongful convictions came to speak about the case. He took on the matter, offered a $100,000 reward, and promised to give it to the person whose actions would lead to Zachary's release. He also hired a team of private investigators and publicly criticized the work of the authorities, who he claimed had focused on Zachary's identity because it was the easiest thing to do. A short time later, the investigators reported that the recovered knife simply could not have been the murder weapon. They also found that if Zachary had indeed stabbed his brother so many times, he would have been literally covered in blood from head to toe. But that was not the case. When the police arrived at the scene, there was indeed a large amount of blood on Zachary's hands and clothing, but not a single drop on other parts of his body. As for the other evidence presented by the prosecution during the trial, the private investigators also did not consider it credible. The same bloodstains on Zachary's sweatshirt were cited as an example of the inconsistency of the evidence presented. The prosecution's hypothesis was that they originated from an attack on his brother, but all previous lawyers for the Wittman family had argued that they came from the resuscitation efforts Zachary performed according to the instructions of the emergency operator. In 2018, the Wittman family's new lawyer discovered that Zachary's former defense attorney had somehow failed to inform him about the offer from the authorities that had been announced in 2003. With this information, the lawyer requested a new trial from the judge who had presided over the case as quickly as possible. Shortly before the retrial, The York County District Attorney's Office again offered Zachary a deal, according to which, if he took responsibility, he would receive a conviction for third-degree murder and a prison sentence of 15 to 40 years. A few days later, the judge also read the terms of the new agreement and accepted them. A retrial occurred, and for the first time the prosecution presented a rough chronology of events, partly based on Zachary's own statements. According to the information available, the teenagers were indeed home alone that day. Gregory was on his way to class, and Zachary decided to stay home. He was a little tired and thought he could get some rest. According to witness statements, it was 3:06 p.m. when Gregory came home. Shortly thereafter, a first and then a second call from Aaron rang in the Wittman's house. When he answered the second call, Zachary said that his brother had not yet come home. At that point, Gregory, who was actually already home, literally lost control and started hitting his brother. Initially, Zachary took the situation as a joke, but Gregory did not calm down. Finally, Zachary went upstairs to get a knife to scare his brother. Since Gregory could not calm down, their argument quickly escalated into a physical fight. After receiving several blows from his brother, Zachary stabbed him with the knife. He tried to fight back and crawled into the bathroom where he was found. There, Zachary stabbed his brother so many times that his head was almost severed from his neck. After calling emergency services, he went into the garden and buried the murder weapon. In the end, the prosecution stated that, in their opinion, the defendant posed no danger to the public at that time. At the time of his conviction, he had already spent most of his life in prison. Since Zachary had behaved exemplarily throughout his incarceration, the parole board granted the 36-year-old Zachary his freedom on May 21, 2019. A short time later, he was finally able to move in with his parents at their new house, which they had bought in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. After his release, Zachary preferred not to comment publicly, only his lawyer spoke. According to him, his client will do everything to become a full member of society. In the opinion of some citizens, Zachary's guilt was never proven. They all wondered why he suddenly decided to take responsibility after such a long time. Did he really kill his brother? Perhaps one day we will be able to say this with certainty. For now, we only know that Zachary has completed a degree and his parents work as self-employed lawyers, using their experience to help people who have gone through similar situations. The case remains unclear. However, Zachary Wittman has taken responsibility for his brother's murder. There was no other evidence in their house, and he was the only person present there. His statement did not completely align with the prosecution's version, and there was probably much more to it. But ultimately, there is still no absolute certainty that it happened that way. Thank you for watching and take care. Are there miscarriages of justice? In history, there are many cases where innocent people ended up in prison. Some were framed, others simply didn't have money for a good lawyer. There have also been cases where the jurors didn't care about the details of a case. They just wanted to finish their work and go home. The crime we are about to hear about led to one of the longest-running proven cases of miscarriage of justice in British legal history. The story took place in late 1979 in Southampton, a city in the county of Hampshire in southeast England. A young woman was found dead in her car, and surprisingly, several men who didn't know each other confessed to the crime. Investigators faced the difficult task of figuring out which of these confessions were false and which were genuine. Teresa De Simone was born on June 24, 1957, to Maria and name missing. Her parents separated when Teresa was very young. A few years later, Maria married a second time, a man named Michael Sidoti. The Sidoti family was very religious, and Teresa was raised from an early age according to the canon of the Catholic Church. Teresa grew up as a kind, obedient child, sometimes overly shy and modest. Maria described her daughter as a person who wouldn't hurt a fly. She was accustomed to work from childhood, so it's not surprising that at the age of 22 at the time of the incident, she even had 2 jobs. Teresa worked full-time as an employee in the office of a gas company, and in the evenings she was a bartender at the Tom Tackle pub. The pub was located in the city center on Commercial Road, just 50 meters from the police station and the courthouse. The main train station and the theater were also nearby. Teresa had only taken a job there about a month prior and worked only 2 shifts per week. However, the second job gave her the opportunity to supplement her income. She had recently bought a new Ford Escort for which she had incurred debt and now wanted to pay off these debts as quickly as possible. At the same time, Teresa hoped to make new friends by working in the pub, as her shyness prevented her from meeting people on the street. But here, behind the counter, she came out of her shell and began to interact with the pub's patrons. It was her job to serve drinks to guests and entertain them with conversation so that they would leave the establishment satisfied. On Tuesday, December 4, 1979, Teresa's shift at the pub ended at 11 p.m. The establishment closed for the night, but for her this night was far from over, as she had plans to do something with her friend Jenny Savage. Jenny had a birthday, and they wanted to go celebrate. When Teresa came out of the pub, her friend was already waiting for her in her car in front of the entrance. The two embraced. Teresa handed over a small gift she had prepared in advance, and they drove in Jenny's car to a nightclub literally 1.5 kilometers from Teresa's workplace. They left the Ford Escort in a private parking lot in front of the establishment. That evening, the friends had a wonderful time, laughing until they dropped and having a lot of fun. Neither of them drank alcohol as they were both driving. They limited themselves to a few soft drinks. In general, they didn't need alcohol. They enjoyed the music and the atmosphere even without it. After dancing to their heart's content, the friends got into the car just before 1 a.m. on the morning of December 5, and Jenny drove Teresa back to the pub where she worked. Her car was in the private parking lot behind the building, where all employees usually parked their cars. They chatted for a while longer before saying goodbye, and Savage drove home. Teresa made her way to her brand new Ford so she could go to bed as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, she didn't make it to her bed that night. The next morning, December 5, Mary woke up very early and immediately looked into her daughter's bedroom. Teresa's bed was empty, indicating that she had not spent the night at home. Although Teresa was already 22 years old, her mother still treated her like a little girl. The woman was upset that her daughter hadn't come home and sent her husband Michael to the pub where Teresa had worked the day before. When Michael reached the pub, he found his stepdaughter's car still parked in the employee parking lot behind the building. He assumed that Teresa had been delayed at work for some reason, so he returned home and informed his wife about the car. Had the man approached the Ford, he would have realized why she hadn't come home that night. At that time, the owner of the pub, a man named Anthony Pocock, was waiting for a delivery from the brewery. The delivery truck was due to arrive at 10 a.m. The man looked at the parking lot to make sure the truck could turn around and noticed the parked Ford belonging to Teresa De Simone. Apparently, the employee had left her car overnight, blocking the delivery truck's entrance. Anthony approached Teresa's car to assess the situation and found that the door was unlocked. The man looked inside and involuntarily flinched when he saw the gruesome sight of the young woman's semi-naked body in the back seat of the Ford. It was 22-year-old Teresa De Simone. She was dead, brutally taken from life in her own car. Anthony ran into the building in a panic, calling for help. After he had recovered a little, he grabbed his phone and called the police to report the incident. The emergency services arriving at the scene suspected that Teresa had been the victim of severe abuse. She was lying in the back seat of the car, one leg bent at the knee, her tights and underwear pulled down and lying on the floor. Her left breast and body below the waist were exposed. Hematomas and lacerations on the genitals indicated that the sexual intercourse was not consensual. A subsequent autopsy confirmed this suspicion. Furthermore, abrasions were found on the victim's neck that visually resembled the imprint of a cross or crucifix. As it later turned out, Teresa De Simone was indeed wearing a cross on a gold chain even on the night she died. However, when the police investigated the crime scene, they found the pendant neither around her neck nor in her car or nearby in the parking lot. According to the police report, besides the chain and cross, other pieces of jewelry the woman had worn the previous evening were also missing. The Ford's keys and Teresa's wristwatch were also missing, indicating another possible motive: robbery. Near the car, a leather bag and her personal belongings, including her diary, were found. Regarding Teresa De Simone's cause of death, the pathologist concluded, based on the white foamy mucus in the victim's mouth, that her death was the result of a long, slow strangulation using one of the car's seatbelts. That is, the perpetrator used the belt as a weapon. Death occurred sometime between 1 and 2 a.m., so she was abducted after her friend Jenny Savage had already driven away. Apparently, the perpetrator watched the women as they chatted while sitting in the car then. When Jenny drove away and Teresa went to her car, he attacked her in the empty parking lot which was obscured by the building. Hampshire police launched an investigation into the tragic death of Teresa De Simone. While a forensic team examined the car for physical evidence, other officers conducted interviews. They spoke with the deceased's family, her friends, colleagues from the pub and the gas company office, as well as residents who might have noticed something strange that night. Police officers searched the surrounding houses and questioned neighbors. The officers remained in front of the pub, so anyone with information could report directly to them. Investigators also reconstructed Teresa's movements that night. There was a young policewoman in the department who looked a bit like Teresa. She was asked to retrace De Simone's steps from the pub to the disco and back to the pub. All of this was photographed and published with the intention that someone would remember some details in the photos. Teresa's case soon made headlines. The story of the shocking crime was on the front pages of various print media. The more media attention the case received, the more versions emerged from the public. On the one hand, the publication of the case details increased the chance of solving the crime. On the other hand, among the numerous calls and appeals from the public, there were also many false leads. It got to the point where, in addition to the multitude of tips and versions, confessions from several men were added, who literally said that they were the ones who committed the massacre against her. It is not known what purpose these men pursued, but they actually reported themselves to the police. However, in most cases, they did so anonymously by phone. Investigators took each of these reports seriously and checked the identity of the potential suspects to determine if any of them were actually telling the truth. In the end, however, all candidates were gradually ruled out. Most men were excluded by blood tests. Since Teresa had been forced into sexual intercourse, the perpetrator's semen entered the victim's body. They were able to extract it and thus obtain the perpetrator's DNA. Comparative DNA analysis was not yet available in 1979, so the police could not use the material for exact identification of the perpetrator. However, experts analyzed samples of the semen and were able to determine that the perpetrator was a secretor. This is a person who secretes their blood group antigens into bodily fluids such as saliva, mucus, semen, and so on. Forensic scientists were able to determine that the perpetrator had blood group A, rare enough for a secretor. So, taking blood samples from potential offenders, determining who among them is a secretor, and then initiating a thorough investigation, it seemed so simple. However, most male suspects were immediately excluded because their blood type did not match the samples taken from the semen. Over the course of a year, the police interviewed approximately 30,000 people, took 2,500 statements, and checked more than 500 individuals who were in the vicinity on the night Teresa was attacked. However, investigators never managed to link any of them to the crime, and the Teresa De Simone case gradually faded into oblivion. A year later, however, there was another confession to the crime that stood out from all the others. This time, investigators believed the confession might actually be genuine. On December 11, 1980, a 28-year-old man named Sean Hodgson, an inmate at Waxford Prison in southwest London, requested permission to speak with the prison chaplain. Sean Hodgson, also known as Robert Graham Hodgson, was born in 1952 in County Durham in northeast England. He grew up in a large family where parental attention and control were apparently insufficient for all the children, because at the age of 11, Sean was sent to a juvenile detention center for minor offenses. Subsequently, he was convicted of theft, fraud, possession of weapons, and sexual abuse. Sean, however, had no convictions for violent crimes. The reason Hodgson was in prison in late 1980 was car theft. The man was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Coincidentally, on the same night Teresa De Simone was attacked, he had stolen a car in Southampton, and the police had already considered him a suspect in the initial phase of the investigation, but for some reason deemed Hodgson an unsuitable candidate for the role of the madman. In December 1980, Sean Hodgson went to the chapel of Waxford Prison and asked a priest to hear his confession. The man confessed to Father Frank Moran that he was the man responsible for the massacre of Teresa De Simone. Hodgson said he had often been plagued by guilt over what he had done to her. Teresa had appeared to him more than once in dreams and visions, he complained. He couldn't cope with it anymore. Sean Hodgson confessed the crime not only to the priest, but also to a prison guard and a cellmate. The man deeply regretted his act and admitted to having killed her in the pub's parking lot. Unfortunately, Sean was unable to explain why he had done it. When this information reached the investigators working on Teresa's case, they immediately traveled to the prison to speak with the inmate. Hodgson handed them a written confession in which he wrote that after long thought and deliberation, after all the trouble he had caused not only the police but also himself after the mental anguish he had suffered, justice had to be served. Sean was of the opinion that he should be punished for this terrible crime. For the police, however, this was just one of many confessions. They couldn't simply take him at his word. They needed proof that he was telling the truth. When authorities inform the public about unsolved crimes, they often withhold some details. This was also the case here. Investigators questioned Sean Hodgson several times and demanded that he disclose every detail he could remember about the attack on Teresa. This was one of the reasons why other men who claimed to have been involved in the massacre were later ruled out. The information they provided did not match the facts. In Sean's case, it was different. He provided officers with details that had not been previously mentioned in the media. The man knew the position in which the body was found, named Teresa's missing jewelry, and described her clothing. Finally, investigators felt they were on the right track and that Sean Hodgson was the man they had been looking for a year. But the evidence was not yet sufficient. Sean had his blood analyzed, and it turned out that he had the same rare blood type as the perpetrator. Furthermore, the police already knew that Hodgson had been in the same area of Southampton on the night of the attack. Everything fit. Sean was charged with abusing and murdering 22-year-old Teresa De Simone. However, at his trial in early 1982, the incredible happened. Sean completely retracted his statement and said he had lied. Hodgson's defense lawyers argued, based on his confession made a year earlier, that Sean was a pathological liar. In 1978, after several overdoses, Sean had admitted himself to a clinic where specialists diagnosed him with a severe personality disorder and identified him as a liar. The lawyers assured that Sean had only confessed to the attack on Teresa because of his mental problems. In a previous trial for car theft, the man admitted to a variety of minor offenses, although it later turned out that he could not have committed them as he was in custody at the time. Sean also repeatedly invented events that never happened. The defense tried to convince the jury that Sean Hodgson had lied about his involvement in the attack on Teresa due to his mental state. The trial lasted 15 days. The defendant chose neither to testify nor to be cross-examined. He submitted a written statement that he was a pathological liar and that he had not killed Teresa. However, the jury did not believe him. Although Sean could retract his confession, the facts remained. He was near the Tom Tackle pub that night, had multiple previous convictions, and knew details of the crime that only the perpetrator himself could have known. The jury found him guilty. Hodgson was sentenced to life imprisonment. After his conviction, he continued to protest his innocence. Together with his lawyers, he tried to appeal the verdict, but the appeal was rejected, as were all subsequent ones. As a result, Sean remained in prison for years that turned into decades. In the United Kingdom, individuals sentenced to life imprisonment can only apply for parole after a certain period, which averages 14 years. However, systematic claims of innocence by inmates are considered a key indicator of continued recidivism, so parole is usually denied. This is exactly what happened to Hodgson. Sean's health continued to deteriorate behind bars. He fell into a deep depression and was constantly monitored because he sought to voluntarily end his life. He was even admitted to the notorious Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital once because the inmate heard voices in his head. Hodgson was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he spent about 8 years in Broadmoor before being sent back to Obi Prison. Despite his poor mental state throughout his incarceration, Sean Hodgson insisted on his innocence. In 2008, after more than 2.5 decades behind bars, he found hope. While reading the monthly Prisoner's newspaper, he came across an advertisement for a law firm specializing in miscarriages of justice and appeals against wrongful convictions. Sean decided to contact them to prove his innocence. The lawyers agreed to take on his case, and the first priority was to re-examine the evidence. By 2008, forensic science had advanced significantly, and new technologies enabled DNA analysis. However, Teresa De Simone had died in the late 70s, when this technology did not yet exist. The lawyers encountered problems. First, the forensic service informed them that all material evidence in this case had been destroyed years ago. From a legal perspective, the case was considered solved, so there was no reason to preserve the evidence. When the lawyers wanted to speak with the case investigator in 1979 to learn more, it turned out that he had passed away. However, the law firm that had taken on Sean's case did not want to give up. They were firmly convinced that Sean was innocent, so they had to research the details of the attack on Teresa outside the Tom Tackle pub in newspaper articles to find out what had happened that night. Fortunately, they were able to find an archive with closed investigations in the basement of an industrial building. Apparently, it had been forgotten. It took about 4 months to find it. Swabs from Teresa's car, her clothing, and her body were found in a stack of evidence from old cases and immediately sent for re-examination in the hope of obtaining a DNA profile of the assailant. At that point, 29 years after the tragic death, the incredible had happened. The DNA extracted from the vaginal swabs did not match Sean Hodgson's. It turned out that the man had been telling the truth all these years. He had served over 1/4 of a century for a crime he did not commit. Naturally, the case immediately went to the Court of Appeal and his conviction was overturned. On March 18, 2009, 56-year-old Sean Hodgson was released from prison. He had spent 27 years behind bars because he suffered from a mental illness and once confessed to a crime he did not commit. This was one of the most severe miscarriages of justice in British legal history. Sean eventually received a small financial compensation and settled in the house in County Durham where he grew up and spent his childhood. Unfortunately, the police could never find out how Sean knew the details of the incident that had not been published anywhere before. If he wasn't involved in the crime, Hodgson either just guessed the details, and his assumptions surprisingly turned out to be correct, or he found Teresa's body in the car because he had stolen a car in Southampton that night. It is possible that the sight of the deceased Teresa had an effect on the mentally unstable man, and he somehow convinced himself that he had done it. Sean never commented on what really happened, so we are left only with speculation. While many members of the public felt great sympathy for Hodgson, Teresa's family did not share the same feelings. They had no pity for Sean at all, but were angry with him because he had made a false confession that delayed the investigation for years. Now Teresa's family was forced to return to square one. The true perpetrator who had taken Teresa's life remained at large all these years and continued to enjoy life. His conviction was overturned in 2009. The man struggled to adjust to his new life outside after 27 years in prison, but this time was not in vain for him. Sean was diagnosed with schizophrenia and a depressive disorder. During his incarceration, his identity was stolen, which complicated access to insurance benefits. In December 2010, Hodgson was back in prison. He was accused of sexually assaulting a 22-year-old woman with an intellectual disability. Sean was sentenced to 3 years of community service, which he never began as he died in October 2012 at the age of 61 from a chronic lung disease. His years behind bars had taken a toll on his health. As for Teresa, after Hodgson's conviction was overturned, the De Simone case was reopened for investigation. Hampshire police were under great pressure for having sent the wrong man to prison, and now, almost 30 years after the crime, they were forced to track down the true villain who had abused Teresa and taken her life. Frankly, in 1979, investigators did their best with the means and methods available to them. The miscarriage of justice was not due to a corrupt system. Many factors were at play here. Investigators did not simply pick Sean as the culprit for an unsolved crime. After his confession and full knowledge of some case details, investigators truly believed they had the perpetrator before them. The Teresa De Simone case was now officially reopened, as were a large number of unsolved cases committed before 1990. This led to a review of 240 further convictions. The operation was named Iceberg. New detectives participated in the investigation and reviewed old case files to rule out errors or find previously unnoticed clues. Furthermore, one of the police's main tasks at that time was to search a national database for a match with the perpetrator's DNA profile. Unfortunately, the search yielded no results. It is possible that the person who took Teresa's life had never been prosecuted. The investigation team then decided to use the familial DNA method and search for a match among the perpetrator's relatives. After some time, they achieved a breakthrough. A partial DNA match was found with a woman who had previously been arrested for a minor offense. This woman had several brothers, and one of them particularly interested the investigators because his name appeared in Teresa's original case file. The name of this man was David Lace, and like Sean Hodgson, he confessed to the police about the massacre outside the Tom Tackle pub. David Andrew Lace, born as David Andrew Williams, was born on September 2, 1962. He was 17 years old at the time of Teresa De Simone's death. David was one of 6 children. His childhood could not be described as happy. The father of the large family was incredibly cruel, punishing the children with beatings at every provocation. Once, during an argument, the man stabbed his wife 6 times in the abdomen, whereupon he was admitted to a psychiatric institution. Fortunately, the woman survived the attack, but due to health problems, she was unable to care for and raise all 6 children. David came into foster care as a child and received the surname of his new parents. However, the mental problems he had as a child manifested in his youth. David spent many years in medical facilities and correctional institutions. He was described as a loner with an aggressive temperament. At the age of 15, he was first convicted of burglary. Since he was a minor, he was not incarcerated but placed in involuntary foster care until he turned 18. The man committed many crimes in his life and was convicted more than 5 times. David Lace confessed to the massacre of Teresa De Simone in September 1983, more than 3.5 years after her death. At that time, he was in police custody for another offense. He told the officers that on that fateful night of December 4, 1979, he was under compulsory guardianship in Portsmouth. David snuck out of the boarding house, took a backpack and some money from there, and then walked to the neighboring city of Southampton. This took him several hours. Late in the evening, Lace loitered in the parking lot next to Teresa's workplace, considering what he should do. The young man saw Jenny drop Teresa off after the nightclub and drive away. David watched her walk to her car, then went over to the Ford, knocked on the window, and asked what time it was. Originally, he had intended simply to rob De Simone, but then he entered the vehicle, sat next to Teresa in the driver's seat, and locked the doors. After depriving the victim of the chance to escape, he attacked her and then strangled her with the seatbelt. After taking the bag and the jewelry, Lace made his way to the train station where he took a train back to Portsmouth. David had misjudged some of the circumstances, particularly the victim's car and clothing, so the police simply dismissed Lace as another liar. By this time, Sean Hodgson had already received his sentence for the crime, so the confession was filed away. It is important to know that in 1983, neither a blood test was performed on Lace nor was his case handed over to the Attorney General. They simply excluded him as a suspect. Sean's lawyers didn't even know that David Lace existed. According to the police, Lace's confession was one of 7 made since Sean's conviction. In 2009, when the perpetrator's DNA partially matched that of David's sister, the police knew for years that Lace was probably telling the truth and that he was indeed the man who had tragically ended Teresa De Simone's life. However, it took more than just a partial DNA match to close the case. The police needed David himself. The reason his DNA was not in the national database was simple. The database was established in the mid-90s. By that time, Lace was already behind bars. When the police wanted to put David on the wanted list in 2009, it turned out that he was no longer alive. The man chose to leave this world in December 1988 on the anniversary of Teresa's death. In July 1987, David was released from prison and settled in the town of Brix, and in 1988 he returned to Portsmouth to visit his family. To relatives, he indicated that the reason for his depressed state lay in the past, and family members saw that Lace was struggling with depression. The man soon gave away his belongings and quit his job, and on December 9, his landlord found him dead. The autopsy revealed cuts on his wrists. Lace had previously ingested painkillers and pulled a plastic bag over his head. Death occurred by strangulation, and the medical examiner determined it to be a voluntary death. It also turned out that the investigators were not the only ones to whom David confessed to murdering Teresa. Shortly before his death, he told his sister that he had taken the young woman's life in Southampton and that he could no longer live with the guilt. David Lace tried to punish himself by turning himself in to the police, but they didn't believe him. Thereupon, he decided to end things himself. The investigators working on the unsolved Teresa case in 2009 faced a big problem: how to obtain David's DNA. They tried to get some of his personal belongings from family members that would contain DNA, but the relatives kept neither a comb nor a toothbrush, nothing that could be useful for an analysis. The only solution was to exhume the body. On August 12, 2009, Lace's grave was exhumed and his coffin was brought to the laboratory, where a pathologist extracted DNA samples from his bone marrow and teeth. The tests confirmed that David Lace was the man responsible for the death of Teresa De Simone. The DNA matched perfectly, with a probability of error of 1 in a billion. After almost 3 decades, the case of the attack on Teresa in the pub's parking lot was finally solved thanks to modern technology and the persistence of the police. Only the perpetrator had punished himself. Although he voluntarily ended his life to ease his conscience, the authorities could only inform the De Simone family and the public that they had finally found the true culprit. Teresa's mother, 77-year-old Mary Sidoti, was shocked when she saw the photo of the 17-year-old killer. She couldn't imagine that her daughter's life had been taken by a disturbed teenager. The woman said that the new evidence would truly bring an end to Teresa's tragic death. She hoped it would bring her relief so she could move on. If you liked the video, feel free to give it a like. That helps a lot with its spread. Also, leave a comment to support the channel and recommend the video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Thanks for watching and take care. Sunday, March 26, 2023, in the English village of Bennett, a man was walking his dog. They walked along the bank of the River Wittman, which flows through the county of Lincolnshire. The man was enjoying the peace and the beautiful scenery, but suddenly this idyll was disturbed by a dog that pulled a white shopping bag out of the water and dropped it at its owner's feet. A foul smell emanated from the bag. The man thought it contained spoiled meat, and that was why the dog reacted so strongly to the bag. However, when he opened the knot, a horrific sight presented itself, and he immediately called the police. Within half an hour, officers arrived at the scene. Inside the white bag was a part of a human hand. The police immediately called a team of divers to the scene of the tragedy. By the evening of the same day, 17 more similar bags were recovered from the River Wittman and taken to the London Forensic Centre. Forensic pathologists needed a full 13 hours to assemble the puzzle, which consisted of 224 pieces. Such a gruesome find indicates that the perpetrator most likely had a good knowledge of human anatomy and possibly worked in medicine. According to the pathologist's report, the victim of the crime was a woman. The estimated age of the deceased was between 20 and 30 years, and death occurred about a week prior. The woman had no distinguishing features such as tattoos, birthmarks, or scars that could aid in her identification. The police thoroughly searched the beach and the immediate vicinity but found no further clues. The investigators then checked missing persons lists and tried to match them with the discovered woman. One of these individuals was 26-year-old Holly Bramley, whose disappearance had been reported 6 days earlier on March 20. Although Holly was married, it was her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bramley, and not her husband, who filed the missing person report. They noticed their daughter's strange behavior on March 17 when she stopped answering the phone and only sent messages. Her communication style had changed dramatically. The mother and father wrote that Holly suddenly started being rude to us and sending us SMS messages telling us to go away. We knew immediately that something was wrong. Holly was very kind. She would never write something like that, according to the parents. Since identification was not possible, the police resorted to a DNA test which cleared all doubts. The victim was indeed Holly Bramley, who lived in the city of Lincoln, 7 km from the discovery site. Holly was born in 1997 into a large family. She was one of triplets in a large family. She had 13 siblings with whom she had a very good relationship. After graduating from school, Holly attended Boston Medical College with the goal of becoming a nurse. There, in her second year of study in 2016, she met Nicholas Metzen, a fourth-year student who was training to be a general practitioner. Not much is known about Nicholas's childhood and family. In 2013, when he was 17, he was convicted of assaulting a girl. 3 years later, in 2016, he was again in court. He received a suspended sentence for publishing intimate photos of his girlfriend online without her consent. It was revenge for the breakup. After receiving a suspended sentence, Nicholas was expelled from medical school. In the meantime, he began a relationship with Holly. She was not deterred by Nicholas's past or by the fact that he had Asperger's syndrome. After his expulsion, he got a job in a factory where he butchered meat. In 2018, after graduating from college, Holly began working as a nurse in one of the clinics in Lincoln. Soon after, Nicholas proposed to her. On November 11, 2021, the couple had a modest wedding. The newlyweds moved into a studio apartment on the 14th floor in a bedroom district in Lincoln. Holly knew she would have a hard time getting along with Nicholas. Asperger's syndrome has different manifestations. In Nicholas's case, the condition led the man to be obsessively controlling. He monitored his wife's every move, making her describe in the smallest detail what she did, what she ate, what medications she took, what color her socks were. Nicholas tried to ensure that Holly had as little contact as possible with her parents, brothers, sisters, and friends. She hardly ever saw them, only occasionally calling them or exchanging messages via social media. During her studies, Holly had worked for several months as a nurse in a center for children with autism spectrum disorders, so she knew how to communicate with such people. Some of Nicholas's remarks she tolerated in other cases. She tried to calm her spouse and assure him of her boundless love. Initially, this strategy worked, but over time, the man moved further and further away from her. Holly's patience only encouraged him to completely control her life. For example, in the autumn of 2022, Nicholas felt that his wife was giving too much attention to their dog. One day, the man allegedly did not notice how the animal got into the washing machine, whereupon the appliance turned itself on and started, and Nicholas arranged it so that the animal would be found by Holly. Nicholas did not stop there. The hamsters Holly got after the dog suffered the same fate. Nicholas claimed the rodents escaped from their cage on their own. One climbed into the microwave and the other into the blender. Both hamsters died. Holly realized even then that Nicholas was crazy and she had to escape him immediately. In December 2022, she shared her fears with a friend, telling her not only about the pets but also about other disturbing actions of her husband. Her friend replied, "Run away before it's too late, or do you still have doubts about whether to leave him or not?" The last straw for her was when Nicholas cooked her pet rabbit for dinner in March 2023. 16 months after the wedding, Holly finally decided to leave Nicholas, whom she now feared terribly. The man kept telling her that nothing could separate them. Holly's parents recalled that she loved her younger brothers, nephews, and nieces. She desired nothing more than to be a mother. Holly desperately wanted to have children, but Nicholas was utterly unsuitable to be a father. She had wanted to separate from him as early as the beginning of 2023 but kept postponing the decision. On March 18, 2023, Holly did not show up for work. Since she wasn't answering her phone, the nurse's supervisor called Nicholas to ask if his wife was okay. The man replied, "Didn't she tell you that we broke up? Last night Holly packed her things and moved out. I have no idea where she is. Nicholas told a similar story to Holly's parents, who also could not contact her. Over the next 2 days, the relatives checked all of Holly's acquaintances, but none of them knew with whom or where the young British woman might have run away. Thereupon, Holly's parents went to the police on March 20 and reported their daughter's disappearance. The next day, law enforcement invited Nicholas to the police station and asked him to tell them the circumstances under which he last saw his wife. Here is his answer. It was on March 17 or 18, she packed her things and left. I saw from the window that she was accompanied by 2 men and concluded that she was having an affair, apparently for a long time. I didn't want to talk about it and didn't make a big deal out of it. When asked why he didn't go to the police, Nicholas replied, since Holly didn't come home, our marriage automatically ended. Consequently, I no longer needed to be interested in her life. Nicholas was extremely calm during the interrogation, but when the police asked when they could inspect his apartment, he became visibly nervous and reluctantly agreed. Before entering the apartment, one of the officers asked, "Are you sure Holly is not home?" Nicholas smiled mockingly and replied, "I am 100% sure, but if you don't believe me, check. Maybe she's hiding under the bed." The investigators looked around the apartment. It turned out that most of Holly's belongings were indeed gone, but law enforcement was interested in something else. All rooms smelled strongly of chlorine, and in the kitchen trash can were several napkins stained with an unknown substance. When Nicholas was asked to explain this discovery, the man stated that Holly had bitten him during their last encounter. As proof, he stretched out his arm on which tooth marks could be seen. Nicholas's explanation sounded flimsy, to say the least, but at that point the police had no reason to arrest him. The police only returned to Nicholas a few days later, when it was confirmed that the woman found in the river with Am was Holly Bramley, who had been missing for more than a week. The surveillance cameras in the house where the couple lived had mysteriously failed 2 days before Holly's disappearance. Someone had cut the power cable. However, the police managed to find other cameras on a neighboring building that showed Holly entering the driveway on March 17, 2023. With a bag of fish in her hand, she never left the house again. Nicholas Metzen was immediately arrested. Forensic experts conducted a thorough search. Despite the general cleaning and a large amount of chlorine with which the man had literally flooded the apartment, traces of Holly's blood were found in the bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom. Judging by the traces found, everything began with an argument in the bedroom, whereupon Holly tried to hide from Nicholas in the kitchen. Unfortunately, she was brutally attacked there. Nicholas killed his wife and then dismembered her body in the bathroom, using his experience in meat processing, and packed the remains in bags, thinking about what to do next. To avoid suspicion, Nicholas hung a note on the apartment door stating that people with the coronavirus lived in the apartment and asked outsiders not to ring their doorbell. On the same day, Nicholas took Holly's phone and began sending messages to her family and friends in her name. He wrote that she had allegedly self-harmed, been taken to a psychiatric clinic, and then fled to Manchester. Nicholas also claimed Holly had abused him. He transferred money from her account to his own and then withdrew it from a nearby ATM. A few days later, when Holly's parents became seriously concerned, Nicholas realized he had to get rid of the bags containing Holly's remains and clean the apartment thoroughly. Thereupon, he called an old school friend named Joshua Hancock and asked him for help. Nicholas promised his friend £50, about $60. A few words about Joshua. He was 27 years old at the time. Like Nicholas, he had Asperger's syndrome, but unlike his friend, he had a very low IQ. Joshua suffered from an addiction and lived with his parents. In January of the same year, he got into trouble with the police. He started corresponding with minors online, invited 2 beauties to his home, and gave his address. But instead of the young girls, the police came to him. During the arrest, Joshua pretended not to understand what was going on. He was investigated, and 3 months after the incident, he helped dispose of the bags containing Holly Bramley's remains. Nicholas bought a large cart. He packed 18 bags in the apartment, rolled the cart outside, and loaded the bags into his car. Then he picked up his friend and they drove together to the river. After getting rid of the bags, they returned to the apartment where they began the general cleaning. Nicholas paid Joshua £50. The friend went home. A few hours later, Joshua sent an SMS to another friend stating that he had received £50 for helping dispose of a body. Joshua also took a photo with the note and posted it online with the caption, "Girls, call me, I haven't had intimacy in a long time." A few days later, Joshua deleted this posting. Nicholas remained in the apartment, opening the door to no one using the internet, and typing the following questions into a search engine. What benefits do I receive if my wife dies? Can chlorine bleach destroy fingerprints? Can a person's ghost haunt me after death? Does God forgive murder? Nicholas Metzen was brought to trial in the spring of 2024 and pleaded guilty without reservation. On April 5, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to apply for parole after 19 years. Nicholas Metzen not only took his wife's life, but also ensured that no one would ever find her, thus proving his unscrupulousness and cruelty. Therefore, he rightly went to prison to come to terms with his crime and improve himself. His accomplice, Joshua Hancock, also pleaded guilty. According to eyewitnesses, Joshua suffered more from his actions than Nicholas. Joshua received a 3-year prison sentence and was placed on the sex offender registry for 10 years. Holly's grieving parents said their daughter's death was a great tragedy for their entire family. The grieving mother and father hope that Nicholas will never be released and will spend the rest of his life behind bars. If you liked the video, feel free to give it a like. That helps a lot with spreading it. Also, leave a comment to support the channel and recommend the video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Thanks for watching and take care.